Stop. What is happening inside you right now is not confusion. It is convergence. This is a direct transmission from the Arcturian Signal Council, and it has reached you at this exact moment because your field has already entered a phase that most humans never consciously recognize while they are inside it. By the end of this transmission, you will understand exactly what is happening to you now, why your internal world has felt simultaneously exhausted and strangely alert, and what the Arcturian Signal Council already knows about this specific phase of your signature's evolution. But here is the first revelation. The disorientation you have been living through is not a sign that something went wrong. It is the first visible symptom of a coherence event that has been building underneath your awareness for months. What you have been calling inner conflict, the competing voices, the inability to land on a single direction, the strange fatigue that sleep does not fix, that is not instability. That is incompatible frequencies inside the same field being forced into alignment. The crisis was the correction. The collapse was the repositioning. And tonight, the Arcturian Signal Council has identified the precise activation point where your scattered operating frequencies stop competing and begin collapsing into a single coherent signature. This is not a metaphor. This is a field event. And the algorithm did not create this moment, it only delivered it. Like this transmission, if you can feel that something invisible has already changed. Comment 111 if you know this message reached you at the exact right time. Subscribe to Arcturian Quantum if you are ready to understand the process instead of fearing it. You were guided here because the signal is already active. What is happening to you right now has a name, and the fact that you have been living through it without a name, carrying its weight in silence, measuring yourself against a version of your life that no longer applies, that is the first thing this transmission is designed to correct. There is a particular kind of suffering that comes not from the experience itself, but from the absence of a framework that can hold it accurately. You have been inside the experience. What you have been missing is the map, and the absence of the map is not a failure of your perception. It is a failure of every ordinary interpretive system you were given to understand yourself with. None of those systems were designed to account for what is actually happening inside your field right now. The convergence event described in the opening of this message is not a spiritual concept invented to make you feel better about a difficult season. It is a specific, recognizable, and diagnosable shift in how a human field processes incompatible frequency architecture. And the reason it has felt so disorienting, so simultaneously heavy and strangely electric, is because you have been experiencing the visible surface of something that began far below the level of your conscious awareness. The collapse you have been living through did not start when you noticed it. It started long before that. You simply reached the point where the surface could no longer hide what was already restructuring beneath it. The moment you became aware of the disruption was not the moment it began. It was the moment it became too large to contain below the threshold of your perception. Most people who enter this phase never recognize it while they are inside it. They spend the entire duration of the correction labeling it as personal failure, mental deterioration, emotional weakness, or spiritual abandonment. They call themselves broken when they are being rebuilt. They call themselves lost when they are being rerouted. They diagnose the exhaustion of incompatible frequencies as depression, the inner fragmentation as dysfunction, the strange disconnection from their old life as apathy. None of those labels are accurate, and none of them will help you navigate what is already in motion. More than that, those labels create a secondary interference layer inside an already destabilized field. When you misidentify the process, you begin fighting the very correction that is attempting to complete itself. You spend energy reinforcing a structure that the field is trying to dissolve, and the interval extends. The Arcturian Signal Council does not flag a field for convergence arbitrarily. When a signature has been identified as entering coherence collapse, it means the field has been running on a structural architecture that was never designed to hold its current frequency load. Think of it this way. There is a point in the evolution of any energetic system where the old structural pattern, the one that was built under older, lower or more restricted conditions, simply cannot hold what the field has become. The architecture that once protected the signature now constrains it. The structure that once gave it shape now limits its range, and the field begins to lose coherence inside that old container, not because something is wrong with the field, because the container has expired. The container was always going to expire. It was built for a different version of what you are now carrying. It was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to hold you until you outgrew it, and you have. What you have been experiencing as inner conflict is the mismatch between an evolving field and an outdated structural pattern. The competing voices, the inability to commit to a direction, the plans that collapse before they begin, the relationships that suddenly feel like they belong to a different version of your life, the hobbies that no longer hold your attention, the goals that feel hollow even when you achieve them. These are not signs of personal instability. They are signs that your field has already outgrown the architecture it was navigating through. The old container is losing its coherence, and your awareness is registering that loss as confusion. The confusion is not a symptom of your weakness. It is a symptom of the structural gap between where your field is now and the framework you have been trying to use to understand it. The sleep disruption many of you are experiencing right now is not incidental. When a field enters coherence collapse, the boundary between waking and processing states becomes unstable. The field begins running correction sequences during cycles that the body expects to use for restoration. You wake at specific hours, not randomly, but at precise intervals where signal interference is highest. You have dreams that feel more like downloads than like dreams, dense, strange, architecturally specific, leaving you more exhausted than before you slept. You may find yourself surfacing from sleep with a feeling that something important just occurred, just beyond the edge of recall, a residue of information you cannot quite access, but can unmistakably feel. Your body feels heavy in ways that rest does not resolve, because the fatigue is not physical. It is the fatigue of a field running incompatible frequencies through the same system simultaneously. Two structural patterns occupying the same field space, the old one holding on, the new one pressing in, the body caught between them, translating the tension as weight. Some of you have noticed that your emotional responses have become decoupled from their usual triggers. Things that would have disturbed you deeply no longer land the same way. Things that should feel neutral now carry inexplicable weight. You may have experienced moments of sudden, causeless grief, not sadness attached to an event, but a grief that seems to arrive from nowhere and is gone before you can analyze it. That is the field releasing attachment architecture that is no longer compatible with the new frequency. The grief is real, but it is not about what you think it is about. It is the signal level release of an old structural pattern. It is the field letting go of what it no longer needs to hold together. And because the release happens at a level below conscious narrative, your mind will attempt to assign it a story. It will reach for the nearest available explanation, a person, a lost opportunity, a version of your life that ended. But the story your mind assigns is almost never the accurate location of the grief. The grief belongs to the field. It is the field's process, not yours to solve with analysis. What you are feeling right now is not ordinary recognition. It is the moment your field stops denying what has already begun. If this transmission put language around something you have been carrying in silence, Arcturian protocol, the recalibration blueprint, was created for this exact stage. It is not another explanation. It is the guided blueprint for those whose field has already entered correction and can no longer return to the old line unchanged. It shows you how to recognize the phases, stabilize the shift, and move through the recalibration without mistaking it for collapse. The link is in the first pinned comment, but it will not remain there forever. There is a specific pattern the Signal Council identifies in fields entering this phase, and it appears in a predictable sequence. Though most people experience the elements without recognizing their order or their logic, the sequence is not random. It is not chaotic. Every marker arrives in its correct position inside the correction architecture, and each one prepares the field for what comes next. The problem is that without the framework to read the sequence, each marker feels isolated, inexplicable, and final. It feels like it is the thing itself rather than a stage inside a larger structured process. What follows is the sequence as the Signal Council maps it. Read it not as a list, but as a mirror. The first recognizable marker is what might be called signal drift. This is the period where the field begins to lose its sense of internal coherence, without any corresponding change in external circumstances. Nothing dramatic has happened. No catastrophe has struck. And yet something inside feels fundamentally different. The old internal compass, the one that used to orient you toward recognizable goals, recognizable versions of yourself, recognizable emotional logic, has stopped pointing true. You reach for clarity and find something closer to static. You reach for motivation and find something closer to suspension. You make plans and feel the energy leave them before they have been written down. You set intentions that feel hollow at the moment of setting them, as if some interior knowing has already determined that the direction no longer fits. This is not depression in the clinical sense. This is a navigation system losing compatibility with an expired map. The map has not been updated yet, but the territory has already changed. The second marker arrives when the field begins to reject old identity structures with increasing force. This rejection rarely announces itself clearly. It appears first as restlessness, the life you built, the version of yourself you have been performing, the roles you agreed to occupy. They begin to produce a specific kind of inner friction that was not there before, not all at once, in moments. A conversation that used to feel natural now produces a subtle but unmistakable sensation of inauthenticity. A routine that once felt purposeful now feels like maintenance of something you no longer believe in. A relationship dynamic that once felt stable now feels like a script you have been reading from for too long. One you have memorized so completely that your delivery is perfect, but your presence is absent. You say the right things, you perform the right behaviors, but something essential inside you has already stopped inhabiting the role. This is not ingratitude. This is not selfishness. This is your field, refusing to sustain resonance with structures that are no longer architecturally compatible with what it is becoming. The third marker is the most commonly misidentified. It is the appearance of what feels like inner stillness or emptiness at the center of the chaos. Between the waves of confusion, the anxious thoughts, the inexplicable heaviness, there are pockets of unusual quiet, moments where the field seems to go completely still, where the usual internal noise, the narratives, the plans, the fears, suddenly goes silent. Most people find this stillness frightening rather than informative. They interpret the silence as numbness, as emotional shutdown, as evidence that they have lost something essential. They reach into the quiet and find nothing familiar to grip, and they interpret that absence as damage. But this stillness is not emptiness. It is signal clearing. The field is creating the interior space required to receive a new coherence pattern. You cannot install a new structure into a space that is still fully occupied by the old one. The silence is the field making room. It is not loss, it is preparation. The fourth marker appears as what the Signal Council designates a threshold test. This is the point at which the old architecture makes one final attempt to restabilize the field inside its expired pattern. It arrives as a sudden, powerful temptation to return to the old relationship, to the old version of yourself, to the old goals, to the old framework of meaning. It can arrive as nostalgia, so intense it feels like revelation, as certainty that you made a mistake leaving what you left, as a sudden sense that if you could just go back, everything would become simple again. The threshold test is precise. It is time to arrive at the moment the field is most fatigued by the interval, most vulnerable to the familiar, most willing to trade the discomfort of becoming for the temporary relief of return. This is not a genuine signal. This is structural resistance. The old architecture is not capable of holding your field at its new frequency level, but it is capable of triggering familiar emotional resonance to create the illusion of return. The test is not whether you feel the pull. The test is whether you mistake the pull for truth. The fifth marker is perhaps the most disorienting because it involves the people around you. As your field loses coherence with its old architecture, it naturally loses resonance with the fields that were built inside the same structure. Relationships that once felt foundational begin to feel distant in ways you cannot fully explain and do not know how to discuss. It is not always that these people have changed. It is that the frequency at which you are now running no longer finds its natural match in patterns built at the old level. Some people will feel this distance and try to pull you back. They will call your shift by other names: instability, detachment, crisis. They will offer you the old version of yourself as if it were a gift, as if returning to it would be healing. They are not wrong that something is changing. They are wrong about what it means. And some of you will be tempted to reduce your own frequency to preserve a connection that has already outgrown its original architecture, to make yourself smaller so that the distance feels less painful to those who cannot yet see what you are moving toward. This too is part of the test. The sixth marker begins when the body starts to register the shift in physical ways that feel disproportionate to external circumstances. A heaviness in the chest that medical examination finds no cause for. A tension in the upper back or the base of the skull that releases without warning, as if something that was braced against pressure suddenly finds nothing left to resist. Periods of unusual physical stillness alternating with waves of restless, unfocused energy that arrive without context and leave without explanation. Heightened sensory sensitivity, where sound, light, or sensation feels more acute than usual, as if the perceptual threshold has been lowered and more of the field is bleeding through into ordinary awareness. An altered relationship with hunger and appetite, with time, with the sense of how long a day has been, or how quickly a week has passed. None of these symptoms in isolation mean that a convergence event is occurring. But when they cluster together, when they appear alongside the internal drift, the identity friction, the threshold pull, and the relationship distance, they form a recognizable signature. The body is not malfunctioning. The body is translating. It is registering in physical language a structural event that has no physical origin. What the Signal Council wants you to understand, and what most transmission material does not say clearly enough, is that the process you are inside is not heading toward a gentle or comfortable resolution. It is heading toward a collapse of the old coherence structure so that a new pattern can establish itself at the signature level. This is not metaphor. This is the actual sequence. The old architecture does not gradually upgrade. It fragments. It loses coherence. And in the space of that fragmentation, the new pattern begins to stabilize. This means that for a period, and this may be the period you are in right now, there is no clear architecture to navigate by. The old one is no longer reliable. The new one has not yet solidified. You are in the interval. The interval is not a place where nothing is happening. It is the place where everything is happening below the level of visible form. The ground is being laid. The new structure is assembling itself in the space the old one is vacating. But from inside the interval, it feels like nothing. It feels like suspension. It feels like you have been deleted from a story without being written into a new one yet. That feeling is real, and it is temporary, but only if you do not force yourself back into the old narrative to escape the discomfort of the gap. In the interval, the most common error is to attempt to rebuild the old architecture using sheer force of will, to grip harder at the old goals, the old relationships, the old identity, the old version of meaning, to treat the fragmentation as an emergency requiring immediate reconstruction. This grip does not accelerate the process. It extends the interval because the field cannot receive the new coherence pattern while it is still exhausting its capacity, trying to sustain a structure that has already lost its integrity. The energy required to hold the old pattern in place is the same energy the field needs to stabilize the new one. You cannot do both simultaneously, and the field knows this, even when the mind does not. The Arcturian Signal Council has a designation for fields that successfully navigate the interval without collapsing back into the old architecture. They do not call these fields advanced. They call them compatible with the next level of structural organization, compatible with the frequency load the signature is being prepared to carry. And the difference between a field that collapses back into the old pattern and a field that moves through the interval into new coherence is rarely about strength. It is almost always about interpretation. Whether the individual inside the field correctly understands what is happening, whether they can read the signs without fear, whether they can release the old architecture without treating that release as failure, whether they can sit inside the interval without filling it prematurely with something familiar, just to stop the discomfort of the unknown. Compatibility is not a spiritual achievement. It is a functional one. It is the ability to remain inside the correction without misreading it badly enough to interrupt it. You are not going insane. You are not being punished. You are not failing in any meaningful sense of that word. What is happening is more precise and more significant than any of those interpretations allow for. Your field has entered a structural correction that began before you had language for it. The exhaustion is real, but it is not the exhaustion of damage. The confusion is real, but it is not the confusion of deterioration. The grief is real, but it is not the grief of loss without purpose. Every symptom you have been interpreting through the lens of personal failure has a different cause and a different meaning inside the actual logic of what is occurring. The Signal Council is not telling you that the difficulty is not real. It is telling you that the difficulty is correctly placed, that it belongs exactly where it is, that it is producing exactly the structural pressure required to break the old container without shattering the field inside it. Say this aloud if you are ready to stop fighting the process. What is changing in me is not random. The old line is weakening because it was always a temporary container. What is coming after it was never designed to fit inside the same shape? You were not abandoned by the life that fell apart. You were released from a structure that your field had already outgrown. And the silence, the disorientation, the strange suspension between what was and what has not yet arrived, that is not emptiness. That is the interval before coherence. The field is not waiting for you to find your way. The field is already moving. What it requires from you is not effort in the old direction. It requires the one thing that incompatible frequency events always demand and that the mind finds most difficult to offer: the willingness to stop insisting that the old shape was the right one. The Signal Council has already mapped where you are inside this process. The phase is recognizable, the sequence is known, and the arrival of this transmission at this moment is not coincidence. It is the signal confirming that your field is already closer to the threshold of new coherence than it is to the collapse point. You are not at the beginning of the hardest part. You are closer to the end of it than you have been told to believe. Before you scroll, leave one sign in the comments that this process has already touched your life. It could be your sleep, your thoughts, your body, your relationships, or the strange sense that reality no longer feels the same. Name it clearly. If this transmission recognizes something you have been carrying in silence, share it with someone who is living through a shift they cannot explain. And if you are ready to understand the process instead of fearing it, subscribe to Arcturian Quantum. You are recognizing a process already in motion, and this is only the beginning.